Okay, Econ students, we are ready to go into a new exciting lesson. And I want to talk now about the economics of drug prohibition. That prohibiting drugs, there's an economic side to it that is somewhat fascinating and interesting, and we're going to get into this right now. So the three big takeaways that you need to know for this lesson are: 1, what's the definition of drug prohibition? 2, why drug prohibition fosters corruption and gang violence, and 3, why drug prohibition reduces product safety. And I'm just going to give you the big picture. Now, drug prohibition is when the government steps in and makes a law prohibiting the use of a certain drug. That's different than what we talked about a week ago when we talked about sin taxes. There are certain things like cigarettes or types of alcohol that might carry a heavier sales tax, a larger sales tax on it. It's called a sin tax. And the idea behind a sin tax is to have people discontinue because they don't, discontinue using that type of a product by charging them more for that. Okay, so that's the idea. Drug prohibition, on the other hand, is the government comes in and says, no, you cannot have cocaine or whatever drug it is. The book talks a lot about cocaine, so I guess I'll stick to that. So, so there's a penalty behind that, imprisonment, fines, and so on. So that's the idea on the definition of drug prohibition. Now, the big picture takeaway is what happens when a drug is prohibited. This is kind of like the economic side. When we get out, believe it or not, we get out the supply and demand charts and we look at this. What happens is when you prohibit something, it becomes scarce. There's not much of it, and therefore it's gonna the cost of it's gonna go up. All right, and in your in our textbook, for those of you that are following along, we use a book by the name of the textbook is the Lessons for the Young Economist. Author is Robert Murphy. It's made available by the Mises Institute. And so he talks about that when a drug is unregulated. Okay, drug A is unregulated. So it might sell, the suppliers might be willing to supply it, let's say, at $1, might be at $1 per measure, whatever the measurement is. They might be willing to sell, let's say, 1 million of those measurements. However, when the drug becomes regulated, meaning illegal, all right, then what happens is suppliers are no longer willing to supply as many for such a low price because of the risk of imprisonment and fines and jail. And so what happens is they cut back and they supply less, and so the supply line shifts to the left, all right, because of risk of imprisonment and fines and so on. And so now the price is going to be higher. The price of that product is going to be higher. There's a new equilibrium because supply has shifted to the left. And that's what happens when something is made illegal. So that's kind of a big picture there. And then, of course, the author talks about how, in the economics of this all, that those agents who are going after drug dealers aren't going to go after the small casual user, but they really want to cut out the suppliers, the big suppliers, and so they go after them. So there's a little bit of conversation about that and the consequences for that. And then drug prohibition, it actually, by prohibiting something and making it illegal, it actually fosters, that means creates violence. It adds to the violence. So what that means is if a drug is not regulated like that, if it's not made unavailable, then it's easy access to get to. But when you have a prohibition of a drug, then what happens is it gets dangerous to go get those because it's illegal. Drug dealers are being wanted by agents, and the casual, the user from time to time who wants to buy could likely put themselves in position of dealing with someone and where there could be violence. And so to get these drugs, yes, violence actually increases because people are enacting in something that's illegal, and they're going to resist. They're going to resist being caught, and that's going to lead to imprisonment. That's going to lead to the violence of maybe police shootings or whatever. So there's that aspect of this, and then of course the safety. Your book talks about the safety issue that results out of drug prohibition. Is that when a drug is prohibited and it goes on the black market, what happens is that particular item is not as pure, and so people will die from like cocaine deaths because they're not getting the pure product. They're getting some kind of a mixture of a product, and therefore it's not nearly as safe as if the drug would be in its pure form. And so when you get things like that, it makes for unsafe violence, and so those are some of the economics issues, things that flow out of drug prohibition. So those are the negative side. We didn't speak on the positive side of drug prohibition because it's pretty obvious that a lot of people think that drugs should be made illegal, that the government should enforce that. But what we're showing you is the economic side of, well, what really does happen when you make something, when you prohibit something. It didn't work with alcohol back in the 1920s, and your book talks about that. There again, you had drug lords and drug dealers and speakeasies and stills and moonshine and all that stuff, and it still didn't keep people away from it. It just made it illegal, and it caused people to be put in the place of violence. And of course, then there's the aspect of the product safety. The particular alcohol or drug wasn't very pure. So that's what your book. That's the big picture of what your book is presenting. It's certainly not making a moral case. We're not making a moral case here. Everybody has to decide that. But what we're doing is we're just looking at the economic side of it. So I hope this helps. As far as the big picture goes, and I hope you find this interesting, and we'll talk more later on this.